She stood in the lobby of Murphy Capital Holdings with twin infants asleep against her shoulders when her husband laughed loudly enough for executives, investors, and employees to hear. Alexander Murphy pointed toward the exit and called Grace nothing more than a stay-at-home mother living off his success. Security hesitated as the room filled with uncomfortable silence, yet Grace never argued. She simply adjusted the blanket covering her babies and quietly watched the elevator leading to the executive floor. No one in that building realized the woman they had just humiliated was the hidden chairperson, whose signature already carried the authority to change every life in that room before sunset. Before we begin, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what your local time is. If you believe respect should never depend on wealth status or appearance, share your city in the comments. And if stories about quiet strength, truth, and justice speak to you, consider subscribing so you won't miss the next journey. Grace Murphy had never imagined that the quietest season of her life would also become the most misunderstood. Most people believed she had disappeared from the business world because motherhood had changed her priorities. That assumption suited her perfectly. It was easier for strangers, and eventually even her own husband, to believe she had given up ambition than to discover the truth hidden behind carefully drafted legal agreements, confidential board resolutions, and years of preparation. Every weekday morning began before sunrise. Long before New York's financial district filled with honking traffic and hurried professionals carrying coffee cups, Grace was already awake. Ethan stirred first almost every morning, followed minutes later by his twin sister Emma. Their cries were never synchronized, yet Grace had somehow learned to anticipate each tiny sound before it became loud enough to wake the other. She moved quietly through the elegant townhouse the family owned on Manhattan's Upper East Side, warming bottles, changing diapers, folding impossibly small clothes, and whispering gentle lullabies while the city outside prepared for another day of competition. Alexander rarely witnessed those mornings. His schedule demanded early meetings, investor breakfasts, and strategy sessions at Aurora Dynamics, the technology subsidiary that had become one of Murphy Capital Holdings' fastest-growing companies. At least, that was how he explained it. He would leave wearing perfectly tailored suits, checking emails, before reaching the front door, already discussing quarterly targets through wireless earbuds. "Another busy day," he often said while straightening his tie in the hallway mirror. Grace always smiled. "I hope it goes well." Those words never changed. Neither did Alexander's answer. "It will. Someone has to keep this family moving." He rarely intended the sentence as an insult, yet each repetition quietly erased everything Grace contributed that could not be measured by revenue reports or corporate presentations. She never corrected him. Instead, she carried Emma to the nursery window, watching Alexander's car disappear into the morning traffic before returning to Ethan, who had already begun reaching tiny hands toward her. To Alexander, she was simply raising children. To Grace, she was protecting the two people who mattered more than every boardroom she had ever entered. Few people knew that only 18 months earlier, Grace had been sitting inside those same boardrooms every week. She had spent nearly a decade preparing for responsibilities few executives ever received. Her father, William Murphy, had built Murphy Capital Holdings from a modest investment partnership into one of the largest privately controlled business groups in the United States. Manufacturing healthcare technology, renewable energy logistics software, and commercial real estate, all eventually operated beneath the same corporate umbrella. William understood something many founders never accepted. Power transferred too suddenly often destroyed both companies and families. Years before Grace married Alexander, he had quietly designed a succession program unlike anything the corporation had attempted before. The future chairperson would not simply inherit authority. She would earn the trust of every independent director, every external auditor, every legal advisor, and every institutional partner before her appointment became public. That process required patience. It also required secrecy. Very few people knew the entire plan. Margaret Ellis, the corporation's longtime general counsel, knew. Daniel Brooks, corporate secretary to the board, knew. Each independent director had signed strict confidentiality agreements. Everyone else believed William remained firmly in control. Even Alexander, especially Alexander. Grace had agreed to every condition. For years, she attended executive meetings without public recognition, reviewed acquisitions under confidential authority, participated in governance committees, and completed leadership evaluations conducted by outside consultants who never treated her as the founder's daughter. She insisted upon that. If she ever became chairperson, it would be because she deserved the position, not because of her last name. When she became pregnant with twins, William suggested postponing the final transition. Grace refused. "The company can wait a little longer," she had told him. "My children cannot." William never argued. He simply smiled. "That's exactly why you're ready." The official succession timeline remained intact. Grace would complete her maternity leave privately while continuing to receive confidential board documents electronically. Her voting authority remained active. Her identity remained hidden. No press release announced any of it. No employee suspected anything unusual, including Alexander. He believed William occasionally asked Grace for informal opinions because she had studied business administration years earlier. Nothing more. As months passed, Alexander's confidence expanded alongside Aurora Dynamics' impressive financial performance. His division exceeded quarterly targets. Industry magazines published interviews praising his leadership. Professional networking sites celebrated him as one of the country's emerging executive talents. Compliments gradually transformed into certainty. Certainty slowly transformed into pride. Pride eventually became something heavier. One evening, while Grace rocked Emma to sleep in the living room, Alexander entered carrying an expensive bottle of champagne. "We closed another acquisition today." Grace smiled warmly. "Congratulations." He poured himself a glass. The board was impressed. "I'm sure they were." "They should be." He laughed softly. "Honestly, I don't know where that company would be without people like me." Grace remained silent. Not because she disagreed, because she already knew exactly how the board had evaluated that acquisition. She had read every due diligence report 2 nights earlier while both babies slept. She knew which directors supported the purchase. She knew which financial risks remained unresolved. She even knew William had instructed additional legal review before approving integration. Alexander believed the deal was already considered flawless. It was not. Grace said nothing. Not because she lacked knowledge, because revealing it would expose everything before the proper time. Alexander mistook her silence for lack of understanding. "You probably don't want to hear about balance sheets." Grace tucked Emma's blanket beneath her tiny chin. "I like hearing about your day." "It's complicated." He smiled politely. "Corporate strategy isn't exactly bedtime conversation." She nodded once. "I understand." The conversation ended there. Not with anger, not with cruelty, simply with another quiet assumption settling between them. Weeks turned into months. Grace's world revolved around feeding schedules, pediatric appointments, storybooks, and 2 growing children who had begun recognizing their mother's voice before opening their eyes. Alexander's world revolved around earnings forecasts, executive dinners, and increasingly ambitious career plans. Their lives still occupied the same home, but they no longer occupied the same conversations. Grace noticed every change. She noticed Alexander checking his reflection longer before leaving each morning. She noticed him mentioning executive titles more frequently. She noticed how often he referred to successful people as those who created value while speaking less and less about kindness, loyalty, or family. She also noticed something else. He had stopped asking how her day had been. Not once in several months. It hurt. Not dramatically, not loudly, just enough to leave a quiet space where partnership had once existed. Late one afternoon, while Ethan and Emma slept side by side, Grace opened the encrypted tablet secured inside her study desk. The familiar corporate portal loaded. Several confidential files awaited review. Board agenda, governance committee recommendations, executive performance summaries, compliance updates. One file immediately caught her attention. Executive Leadership Assessment, Aurora Dynamics. Alexander's name appeared on the cover page. Grace stared at the document for several long seconds. She did not open it immediately. Instead, she looked toward the nursery monitor. Both babies remained peacefully asleep. Only then did she return her attention to the screen. Outside that room, she was simply a quiet mother raising twins. Inside the corporation's most protected records, she remained the future chairperson, entrusted with judging the very executive who believed she knew nothing about the world he claimed to control. Alexander Murphy had always been ambitious. Ambition itself had never been the problem. When Grace first met him several years earlier, she admired the discipline behind it. He was intelligent, articulate, and willing to outwork almost anyone around him. He volunteered for difficult assignments, accepted responsibility when projects failed, and spent long evenings studying markets while many of his colleagues hurried home. Those qualities had impressed Grace long before she ever considered marrying him. Back then, Alexander measured success by effort. Now, he increasingly measured people by status. The change had happened so gradually that almost no one noticed, not even Alexander himself. Aurora Dynamics continued to outperform expectations. The company's artificial intelligence logistics platform had secured several high-profile government contracts, while its renewable energy division expanded into 3 additional states. Financial publications praised the executive team, and Alexander's interviews appeared regularly in business magazines. Each article seemed to make him stand a little taller. Each compliment made him slightly less willing to hear criticism. One Monday morning, the executive conference room buzzed with excitement before the weekly leadership meeting. Brian Foster leaned comfortably against the polished oak table while scrolling through an industry publication on his tablet. "There you are," he called as Alexander entered. Nathan Cole looked up from his laptop and grinned. The celebrity finally arrived. Alexander laughed. "I wouldn't go that far." Brian rotated the tablet toward him. The headline displayed a photograph of Alexander standing confidently beside Aurora Dynamics' headquarters. The executive driving the future of American innovation. Brian whistled. "I've been telling everyone we're working beside the next CEO." Alexander smiled modestly, though the satisfaction in his eyes was impossible to miss. "The board hasn't made any decisions." Nathan closed his laptop. "They don't have to announce it yet." He lowered his voice dramatically. "Everyone already knows." Alexander chuckled but made no effort to dismiss the idea. Instead, he took his usual seat at the head of the table. The small gesture did not escape anyone's attention. Neither did the confidence with which he now conducted every meeting. He interrupted more often. He delegated without discussion. He expected agreement before explanations. Most employees adapted quickly. Some admired decisive leadership. Others simply feared disagreeing. Meanwhile, several floors above another meeting unfolded in complete silence. William Murphy sat beside Margaret Ellis and Daniel Brooks, inside one of Murphy Capital Holdings' private boardrooms. Unlike Alexander's energetic presentations downstairs, this room contained no unnecessary conversation, only facts. Daniel distributed confidential folders. "The latest leadership evaluations have arrived." Margaret adjusted her glasses. External consultants completed all interviews last week. William nodded once. No conclusions yet. He looked toward the large windows overlooking Manhattan. We continue observing. No one questioned the instruction. The succession process had never been about quarterly profits alone. Financial performance mattered. Character mattered more. Downstairs, Alexander proudly presented another successful quarter. Upstairs, the board quietly evaluated something entirely different. Grace knew exactly what both meetings contained. That afternoon, after Ethan and Emma finally fell asleep following an unusually restless morning, she logged into the corporation's encrypted governance system. Her access remained identical to every voting director. Dozens of confidential reports waited for review. She skimmed through compliance updates before opening the newest leadership assessment. Alexander's name appeared once again. She hesitated. Reading objective evaluations about one's own husband felt strangely impersonal. Still, responsibility required honesty. The report praised his strategic thinking. It highlighted exceptional negotiation skills. It recognized strong financial discipline within several operating divisions. Grace smiled slightly. Those observations were accurate. Then the report changed. Several anonymous interviews described increasing arrogance. Employees reported difficulty raising concerns. Department heads felt dismissed during planning sessions. Cross-functional cooperation had noticeably declined. One sentence remained on Grace's screen longer than the others. Executive confidence increasingly suppresses constructive disagreement. She quietly closed her eyes. No accusation, no dramatic language, just one carefully documented observation. Exactly the kind of detail the board considered seriously. She closed the report without making comments, not because she disagreed, because additional evidence would eventually speak for itself. Later that evening, Alexander returned home unusually energized. He barely removed his jacket before speaking. "You know who called today?" Grace looked up from assembling a small wooden toy for Ethan. "Who?" "The governor's economic advisory office." "Really?" "They're considering me for a regional innovation council." Grace genuinely smiled. "That's wonderful." Alexander accepted the praise with visible satisfaction. "I've worked hard for opportunities like this." "You have?" He walked into the kitchen, poured sparkling water into a glass, then leaned casually against the counter. "You know." He paused. "Sometimes I wonder what your life would look like if we hadn't met." Grace looked at him quietly. "What do you mean?" "I mean," he shrugged, "you'd probably still be working somewhere ordinary." He laughed softly. "Now you get to stay home without worrying about anything." Grace gently placed the toy beside Ethan's crib. "I've always been grateful for what we have." "I know." Alexander smiled. "I just hope you realize how fortunate you are." Grace answered with the same calm voice she had learned to protect over the years. "I do." She did not mention that the townhouse legally belonged to a family trust established by William Murphy years before the wedding. She did not mention that Alexander's executive compensation ultimately came from a corporation whose controlling authority already rested under confidential succession documents bearing her own signature. She simply returned to folding baby clothes. Across the room, Emma giggled while reaching toward colorful building blocks scattered across the carpet. Grace crawled beside her daughter and helped stack them into a small tower. Emma immediately knocked them over. Grace laughed. They built another. Emma knocked it down again. Alexander watched briefly before checking another email. "I've got a dinner tomorrow. Business. Investors. What time?" I'll probably be late. Grace nodded. I'll keep dinner warm. You don't have to wait. I don't mind. He barely heard the answer. His phone vibrated again. Another invitation. Another congratulatory message. Another article praising Aurora Dynamics. His world had become increasingly filled with people telling him how exceptional he was. Very few reminded him to remain humble. The following Friday, Eleanor Murphy invited the family to lunch. Grace packed bottles, diapers, blankets, extra clothes, and enough supplies to care for the twins throughout the afternoon. Alexander carried only his car keys. During lunch, Eleanor proudly described Alexander's recent achievements to several relatives gathered around the dining table. Our Alexander may be running the entire corporation one day. Everyone smiled. One cousin turned toward Grace. You must be proud. Grace answered honestly, I am. Eleanor looked at Grace's simple sweater and comfortable shoes before speaking with a polite smile that barely concealed her judgment. Motherhood suits you. Grace thanked her. Eleanor continued. Not every woman is meant for business anyway. Several relatives exchanged awkward glances. Alexander remained silent. He neither agreed nor defended his wife. Grace noticed. She always noticed. But she reached for Emma's bottle instead of responding. The conversation soon returned to Alexander's career. Grace became almost invisible for the remainder of the afternoon. Driving home later, the silence inside the car lasted nearly 20 minutes. Finally, Grace spoke. Your mother seems very excited about your future. Alexander smiled. She believes in me. So do I. He glanced briefly toward her. You know, he hesitated. I think she's right about one thing. Grace waited. You seem happier staying home. She looked out the passenger window at the passing Manhattan skyline. I love being with Ethan and Emma. But, she turned back toward him. Loving my children doesn't mean I stopped being the person I was before they were born. Alexander misunderstood immediately. You miss working, Grace answered carefully. I miss contributing. Alexander smiled reassuringly, convinced he understood. Raising children is contributing. It is. So don't worry about everything else. Grace nodded slowly. He still didn't understand. Not because he lacked intelligence, because he had quietly begun believing that only the contributions visible to him truly mattered. Far above the city lights that evening, another encrypted notification arrived inside Grace's secure corporate portal. Subject: Executive Performance Monitoring. Phase 2. She stared at the unopened message while Ethan slept against her shoulder and Emma rested peacefully beside them. Outside that room, she remained a mother whose sacrifices went unnoticed. Inside, Murphy Capital Holdings, the next stage of evaluating Alexander Murphy, had quietly begun. The first time Alexander embarrassed Grace in public, he apologized before they reached home. The second time, he claimed people had misunderstood his joke. By the fifth or sixth occasion, he no longer bothered explaining. Somewhere between professional success and growing admiration from the people around him, courtesy had quietly become optional. Grace noticed the pattern long before anyone else did. She never counted the incidents. She remembered the expressions instead. The uncomfortable smile from a restaurant server, the lowered eyes of a junior employee, the sympathetic glance of a stranger in a grocery store. Those silent witnesses often looked more embarrassed than she felt herself. Grace had learned that humiliation rarely belonged only to the person receiving it. It spread quietly through everyone decent enough to recognize it. On a cool Saturday afternoon, Alexander invited several colleagues to their townhouse for an informal networking lunch. It'll only be a few hours, he said while adjusting framed photographs in the living room. I'd appreciate it if everything looked presentable. Grace smiled. I've already prepared lunch. The dining table displayed roasted chicken, fresh vegetables, homemade breadfruit salad, and desserts she had made while the twins slept during the morning. Everything looked warm and welcoming. Alexander glanced around approvingly. This is good. Grace noticed something. He complimented the meal, not the person who had spent 5 hours preparing it. She did not expect praise. She simply noticed. The guests arrived shortly before noon. Brian Foster entered first, carrying a bottle of wine. Nathan Cole followed with expensive pastries from a famous bakery downtown. Rebecca Turner arrived last, balancing a bouquet of flowers and a small gift for the twins. Unlike the others, Rebecca walked directly toward Grace. These are for you. Grace accepted the flowers with genuine surprise. You didn't have to. I wanted to. Rebecca smiled warmly. And I'd love to meet those famous babies I've heard so much about. Grace laughed softly. They're finally asleep. I'll admire them from a distance. It was a simple conversation, respectful, uncomplicated. Grace appreciated it more than Rebecca realized. Lunch began pleasantly. Most discussions centered on Aurora Dynamics' rapid expansion. Alexander enthusiastically described upcoming contracts, new partnerships, and ambitious growth targets. His confidence filled the room. Brian nodded frequently. Nathan agreed with nearly every conclusion. Rebecca contributed thoughtful financial observations whenever conversation allowed. Grace mostly listened while quietly serving food and refilling glasses. At one point, Brian turned toward her. So, Grace? He smiled politely. Alexander says you've become a full-time expert on diapers. Before Grace could answer, Alexander laughed. The best promotion she ever received. Several people chuckled politely. Grace smiled faintly. The twins certainly keep me busy. Alexander leaned comfortably into his chair. Honestly, I don't think she misses business at all. Nathan laughed. Why would she? He gestured around the elegant dining room. Looks like she's living the dream. Alexander nodded. No deadlines. No investors. No difficult decisions. Just babies. Grace quietly placed another serving dish onto the table. Rebecca noticed her expression. Not hurt, not angry. Just quiet. Rebecca decided to change the subject. I imagine raising twins requires thousands of decisions every day. Grace looked toward her gratefully. It does, Rebecca smiled. I'd probably fail during the first week. Everyone laughed. The tension briefly disappeared. Then Alexander spoke again. It's still easier than running a company. The room fell silent. Grace slowly folded her napkin. I wouldn't compare them. Alexander shrugged. I'm only saying. He grinned toward Brian. One actually creates economic value. Nobody answered immediately. Nathan looked down at his plate. Brian suddenly found his drink fascinating. Rebecca calmly placed her fork beside her plate. She spoke carefully. I think every family values different kinds of work. Alexander waved dismissively. Of course. I'm just being realistic. Grace met his eyes for only a second. Then she smiled gently. The food is getting cold. She redirected the conversation before anyone else felt obligated to rescue her. The afternoon continued. People discussed travel, sports, technology, politics. Anything except what had just happened. When the guests finally prepared to leave, Rebecca lingered near the front door. She waited until the others stepped outside. Then she quietly turned toward Grace. I hope you know. She hesitated. You handled that with remarkable grace. Grace smiled. Thank you. Rebecca lowered her voice further. Sometimes silence says more than arguments. Grace nodded. It usually does. Rebecca studied her face for another moment. There was no bitterness there, only extraordinary patience. Driving away later, Rebecca could not stop thinking about the afternoon. Something about Grace seemed strangely familiar. Not her appearance, her composure. She had seen executives remain calmer during hostile shareholder meetings than most people manage during ordinary conversations. Grace possessed that same unusual self-control. Rebecca could not explain why. Back inside the townhouse, Alexander closed the front door and loosened his tie. That went well. Grace gathered empty coffee cups. Most of it. He frowned. What does that mean? She stacked plates carefully. You embarrassed me. Alexander looked genuinely confused. When? During lunch. He laughed. Oh. You mean the joke? Grace placed another plate into the dishwasher. It didn't feel like a joke. Alexander sighed. Grace, you take things too personally. I wasn't trying to hurt you. She faced him calmly. I believe you. Then what's the problem? The words. He crossed his arms. I was complimenting what you do. Grace remained patient. You said raising our children creates less value than running a company. I said economically. You also laughed. Alexander shook his head. This is exactly what I mean. What? Everything becomes emotional. Grace stood quietly for several seconds. Then she answered with complete honesty. I wasn't emotional. I was disappointed. The sentence landed harder than she intended. Alexander looked away first. Neither of them spoke again. That evening, after bathing, Ethan and Emma, Grace sat alone in the nursery while both babies slept peacefully. The soft nightlight cast gentle shadows across the room. She opened a small leather notebook from the drawer beside the rocking chair. Its pages contained dates. Nothing dramatic, nothing exaggerated. Simply observations. Comments made, situations witnessed, people present, how each incident affected their family. Grace never intended the notebook to become primary evidence. It began months earlier at Margaret Ellis's suggestion. If you're ever placed in a position where facts matter, Margaret had quietly advised during one confidential meeting, memory alone becomes unreliable. Write only what happened. No opinions, no assumptions, just facts. Grace had followed that advice. Today's entry was brief. Saturday. Lunch with Brian Foster, Nathan Cole, Rebecca Turner. Alexander stated that caring for twins created less value than running a company. Multiple witnesses present. Conversation redirected without argument. She closed the notebook. No anger filled those pages. Only truth. Meanwhile, 20 blocks away, William Murphy reviewed quarterly governance updates with Margaret Ellis. Margaret placed another folder across the conference table. This concerns Aurora Dynamics. William opened it slowly. Anything urgent? No violations? Not yet, she paused. But we've received several consistent observations. William read silently. Employee interviews, leadership evaluations, communication assessments. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Exceptional performance, declining humility, increasing public disrespect toward subordinates, growing reluctance to accept criticism. William finally closed the folder. And at home, Margaret hesitated. I've heard enough. You spoke with Grace? No. She never volunteers personal information. William smiled sadly. That's my daughter. Margaret continued. But other people notice. William looked toward the dark skyline beyond the windows. Character always reveals itself eventually. It doesn't matter whether anyone is watching. He paused. Sometimes, especially when they aren't. The following Tuesday morning, Grace received another confidential notification through the encrypted board portal. Subject: supporting documentation added. Executive Leadership Review. She opened the attachment. Several new witness statements had been uploaded. Anonymous, objective, professional. One paragraph immediately caught her attention. The executive frequently minimizes domestic responsibilities while elevating his own professional contributions during public conversations. Grace quietly closed the file. She had never reported Alexander. She never needed to. His own words were beginning to build the record. And somewhere ahead, though, Alexander remained completely unaware of it. Every casual remark he believed people had already forgotten was slowly becoming part of a much larger picture. Alexander Murphy had never questioned how information moved through Murphy Capital Holdings. In his mind, reports traveled upward through predictable corporate channels. Department managers submitted updates to division executives. Division executives reported to senior leadership. Senior leadership briefed William Murphy. Decisions came back down. It was a structure every large corporation followed. Or so he believed. What he never realized was that another secure layer existed above the visible hierarchy. Every significant governance report reached a confidential digital portal accessible only to the chairperson, the board of directors, the general counsel, and the corporate secretary. For nearly a year, Grace Murphy had quietly reviewed those reports from a small study only a few steps away from the nursery where Ethan and Emma slept. No employee knew, no executive suspected, not even the managers who prepared the documents. On a rainy Wednesday morning, Grace sat beside the nursery window, with Emma asleep in her arms, while Ethan played quietly with wooden alphabet blocks on the rug. Rain tapped gently against the glass. The city beyond appeared wrapped in gray clouds. Her encrypted tablet vibrated once. A new governance notification. Grace carefully transferred Emma into her crib before opening the document. The title immediately drew her attention. Internal Financial Review, Aurora Dynamics. She read slowly. No conclusions had been reached. The review simply listed several transactions requiring clarification. Large hospitality expenses. Consulting invoices approved unusually quickly. Travel reimbursements exceeding company guidelines. None of them alone suggested misconduct. Together, however, they formed a pattern that responsible governance required investigating. Grace continued reading. Every observation remained factual. No accusations, no dramatic language. Exactly as corporate compliance procedures demanded. She closed the report without making immediate comments. Experience had taught her that incomplete information often produced incorrect conclusions. Evidence deserved patience. Across Manhattan, Aurora Dynamics' executive floor buzzed with confidence. Alexander stood before a wall-sized digital presentation outlining ambitious expansion goals. Brian Foster leaned back comfortably in his chair. If we secure the Chicago acquisition, we'll dominate the Midwest market. Nathan Cole nodded enthusiastically. The media campaign is already prepared. Alexander looked around the room. What about financing? Rebecca Turner opened a detailed spreadsheet. We have sufficient liquidity. She hesitated. Provided discretionary spending remains within approved limits. Alexander barely glanced at the numbers. We're well below budget. Rebecca answered carefully. Most departments are. Alexander looked up. What does that mean? There are several expense categories I want to review before quarterly reporting. Brian laughed lightly. Rebecca, you worry about every dollar. She smiled politely. It's my job. Alexander closed the presentation. Then review them. I'm confident everything is fine. The meeting moved on. Rebecca remained thoughtful. She had reviewed corporate finances for nearly 20 years. Numbers rarely lied. People sometimes did. Certain reimbursement requests had begun attracting her attention. Luxury restaurants, private club memberships, entertainment expenses described only as client development. Individually, each payment could be justified. Collectively, they required explanation. Not because they were necessarily fraudulent, because governance required transparency. Later that afternoon, Rebecca knocked quietly on Margaret Ellis's office door inside Murphy Capital Holdings headquarters. Margaret looked up from several legal documents. Come in. Rebecca entered carrying a slim blue folder. I don't have evidence of misconduct. Margaret listened carefully. But I have enough irregularities to recommend a formal compliance review. Margaret accepted the folder. What kind? Expense authorization. Vendor approval timing. Documentation consistency. Margaret flipped through several pages. You've spoken with Alexander? Not yet. Why? Rebecca answered honestly. I wanted legal involved before asking questions. Margaret nodded slowly. The right decision. Corporate investigations existed to establish facts, not assumptions, not personal opinions. Margaret reached for her secure telephone. I'll inform Mr. Murphy. Rebecca understood immediately which Mr. Murphy she meant. William, not Alexander. Within the hour, William Murphy received the preliminary review inside his private office. He studied every page before speaking. Has Grace seen this? Margaret answered, without hesitation. Not yet. William considered the question for several seconds. She will. Through normal governance procedures. No exceptions. Margaret nodded, as always. William leaned back thoughtfully. The succession process cannot protect family. It must protect the company. Neither of them needed to explain further. If Alexander had acted appropriately, evidence would confirm it. If he had not, evidence would confirm that as well. Family relationships changed nothing. That evening, Alexander returned home unusually pleased with himself. I've got good news. Grace looked up from feeding Ethan. What happened? The Chicago acquisition is almost finalized. Congratulations. He smiled broadly. The board is going to love this. Grace gently wiped formula from Ethan's cheek. I'm sure they'll review everything carefully. Alexander laughed. They already trust my judgment. Grace noticed the wording. Not our team, not our division. My judgment. She quietly stored the observation away. Alexander continued. I've been thinking. About what? Once I move into a larger executive role. He looked around the townhouse. We should probably buy something bigger. Grace smiled softly. This house has been good to us. It's nice. But people at my level usually live differently. Grace glanced toward the staircase where Emma had just begun crying upstairs. I'll be right back. She carried herself upstairs without answering. Alexander interpreted her silence as disinterest. In reality, Grace simply knew something he did not. The townhouse belonged to the Murphy family trust. It could not be sold. Nor had Alexander ever needed to purchase it. He believed years of bonuses had funded their comfortable life. Grace had never corrected that misunderstanding. Not because she wished to deceive him, because confidentiality agreements prevented her from discussing the family's financial structure before the official succession announcement. Later that night, after both children had fallen asleep, Grace finally opened the confidential compliance report Margaret had released through the board portal. Every page contained supporting documentation, expense summaries, approval records, internal accounting notes. Several transactions had been highlighted for further verification. Grace recognized one approving signature immediately: Alexander Murphy. She read every page twice. Nothing conclusively established wrongdoing. Yet something continued troubling her. Certain client dinners occurred on dates when no client meetings appeared on company calendars. Some invoices lacked detailed descriptions. Several vendor approvals moved unusually quickly through internal systems. Individually insignificant, collectively unusual. Grace opened another secure file: Executive Ethics Compliance Policy. She reread several sections, despite already knowing them almost by heart. Transparency, conflict disclosure, financial accountability, documentation requirements, simple rules, clear expectations, designed to protect both companies and honest employees. Her encrypted phone vibrated, a secure message from Daniel Brooks. The Governance Committee has scheduled an extraordinary review next Thursday. Grace typed a brief reply: "I'll attend remotely if necessary." Daniel responded almost immediately: "Chairperson attendance is recommended." Grace looked toward the nursery. Both babies slept peacefully beneath soft blankets. She closed her eyes briefly. Balancing motherhood with invisible leadership had never felt heavier. The next morning, Rebecca Turner continued examining Aurora Dynamics' financial records. One reimbursement request immediately caught her attention: a luxury restaurant, nearly $12,000. Purpose listed simply as strategic client engagement. She searched the calendar. No client meeting appeared that evening. Instead, Alexander had attended an industry awards ceremony. Rebecca frowned. Perhaps the calendar simply omitted private discussions. She checked visitor registration records. Nothing. Parking records. Nothing. Reception logs. Nothing. She opened another file: corporate credit card statements. The same restaurant appeared twice more during the previous quarter. Again with vague descriptions, again without supporting schedules. Rebecca did not jump to conclusions. Instead, she documented each inconsistency carefully. Facts first, interpretation later. By Friday afternoon, Margaret Ellis possessed enough information to recommend a formal internal audit under Murphy Capital Holdings' governance policies. William approved the recommendation immediately. "No interviews yet," he instructed. "Collect documents. Preserve evidence. Allow facts to speak before people do." Margaret nodded. "The audit begins Monday." Far across the city, Alexander celebrated another successful week with Brian and Nathan over expensive drinks. Brian raised his glass. "To the future, CEO." Nathan laughed. "I'll drink to that." Alexander smiled. "I appreciate the confidence." Brian leaned forward. "Honestly, I don't think anyone else is even close." Alexander believed him completely. He had no idea that while congratulations echoed around his dinner table, another team inside the same corporate family had quietly begun reviewing every financial decision carrying his signature. And for the first time since joining Aurora Dynamics, Alexander Murphy's greatest challenge would not come from competitors. It would come from the ordinary documents he had signed without imagining who would eventually read them. By the time Murphy Capital Holdings announced its annual Strategic Vision Gala, nearly every influential business publication in the country planned to cover the event. The gala was more than a celebration. It was where future investments were introduced, partnerships were strengthened, and senior executives quietly demonstrated their importance before investors who controlled billions of dollars. For Alexander Murphy, it represented another opportunity to shine. For Grace Murphy, it would become the day she finally understood how far her husband had drifted from the man she had once married. 3 days before the event, Alexander walked into the kitchen while Grace was preparing breakfast for Ethan and Emma. "I need a favor." Grace looked up from cutting fresh fruit into tiny pieces. "What is it?" "The gala is Thursday evening." "I know. I'd like you to come." Grace smiled slightly. "We haven't attended an event together in months." Alexander nodded absent-mindedly while checking messages on his phone. "Yes, but don't misunderstand." Grace waited. The twins have been getting a lot of attention from everyone in the family. He slipped the phone into his jacket pocket. "People keep asking to see them." Grace felt something tighten quietly inside her chest. "You want me to bring the babies?" "It'll only be for a little while." "And afterward?" Alexander shrugged. "You can head home." "What about you?" "I'll stay. There are executive meetings after the gala." Grace looked at him for several long seconds. "So you don't actually want me there?" Alexander frowned. "I didn't say that. You don't need to." He sighed impatiently. "Grace, this is a business event. You'd probably be uncomfortable sitting through corporate discussions anyway." She lowered her eyes toward Emma, who was happily banging a tiny spoon against the high-chair tray. "I understand." Alexander smiled, believing the conversation had ended well. "I knew you would." Grace never mentioned that she had attended more board meetings than nearly every executive expected to be present that evening. She simply continued feeding her children. The day of the gala arrived beneath clear autumn skies. Murphy Capital Holdings headquarters stood illuminated against the Manhattan skyline, its glass exterior reflecting the golden colors of the setting sun. Luxury vehicles lined the entrance. Television crews waited behind security barriers. Inside, employees hurried through final preparations, while executives greeted investors with polished smiles. Grace dressed differently from everyone else attending. She wore a simple, cream-colored dress beneath a light gray coat comfortable enough to carry 2 infants for several hours. No expensive jewelry, no designer accessories, only her wedding ring. She secured Ethan into one infant carrier while gently lifting Emma into her arms. Alexander glanced toward her before adjusting his cufflinks. "That's fine." Grace smiled politely. "What is—" "You don't need to dress up. We're only staying briefly." She simply nodded. The drive into Manhattan passed mostly in silence. Alexander spent nearly the entire trip answering emails and approving documents from his phone. Grace watched city lights pass beyond the window while softly humming to calm Emma. Neither noticed how symbolic the journey had become. One of them traveled toward public recognition. The other traveled toward public humiliation. As they entered the headquarters lobby, conversations briefly paused. Several employees smiled warmly at the sight of the twins. "Oh my goodness. They're adorable. I can't believe how much they've grown." Grace thanked everyone kindly. Many employees knew her only as Alexander's wife. A quiet young mother, nothing more. Rebecca Turner approached carrying several folders. She immediately smiled. "I've been hoping you'd bring them." Grace laughed softly. "They insisted." Rebecca bent slightly toward Ethan. "Hello there, future troublemaker." Ethan reached toward her glasses, making everyone nearby laugh. For a brief moment, everything felt wonderfully normal. Then Alexander appeared beside them. "We should keep moving." He glanced toward Grace. "Don't let the babies make too much noise." Rebecca looked at him. "They're babies." Alexander forced a small smile. "I know." I just don't want distractions tonight. Grace quietly shifted Emma higher against her shoulder. We'll be careful. Inside the grand ballroom, crystal chandeliers reflected warm light across hundreds of elegantly dressed guests. Investment bankers, corporate attorneys, technology founders, government officials, board members, international partners. Every table carried polished silver place settings and carefully arranged floral centerpieces. Grace noticed something immediately. Her name did not appear beside Alexander's. Instead, she found a temporary guest badge directing her to a family seating area near the back of the ballroom. She looked at Alexander. Our seats are different, he answered casually. Executives sit near the stage. I thought we came together. We did. He adjusted his jacket. But the seating chart is fixed. Grace knew that wasn't entirely true. Board protocol allowed last-minute adjustments. She simply said nothing. Margaret Ellis observed the exchange from across the room. Standing beside Daniel Brooks, she quietly asked, "Did you notice?" Daniel nodded. Every word. Margaret sighed. Grace hasn't complained once. She won't, Daniel answered confidently. That's not who she is. William Murphy entered moments later through a private corridor reserved for senior leadership. Several executives immediately walked toward him. Alexander joined them enthusiastically. Grace remained near the family seating area with Ethan and Emma. William's eyes found his daughter almost instantly. For only a brief second, father and daughter exchanged a quiet smile. Nothing more. No greeting. No acknowledgement that might reveal their relationship. The succession plan demanded complete discretion. The gala began. A short orchestra performance filled the ballroom. Company achievements appeared across enormous digital screens. Alexander's division received special recognition for exceeding annual targets. Applause echoed throughout the hall. Alexander stood proudly as cameras focused on him. Grace clapped gently while rocking Emma to sleep. Halfway through the evening, Ethan began crying, not loudly, simply the restless cry of a tired infant surrounded by unfamiliar sounds. Grace immediately stood. She gently bounced him against her shoulder while whispering soothing words. Most nearby guests barely noticed. Alexander did. From the stage where several executives gathered before the next presentation, he glanced toward the back of the ballroom. His expression hardened. During the short intermission, he walked quickly across the room. Several colleagues followed. Brian Foster, Nathan Cole, Eleanor Murphy, a handful of department managers. Grace smiled when she saw him approaching. I've almost settled him. Instead of answering quietly, Alexander looked around at the nearby guests. His voice carried farther than he realized. I told you this wasn't the place for that. Conversations nearby slowed. Grace blinked. I'm taking him outside. You should have stayed home. The sentence landed heavily between them. Grace remained calm. I thought you wanted us here. Alexander laughed once. I wanted people to meet the twins. He looked around. Not hear them? Several nearby guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. Grace lowered her voice. They're only babies. Alexander answered without lowering his own. And this is a billion-dollar corporate event. Brian shifted awkwardly. Nathan stared toward the floor. Rebecca Turner had stopped several feet away, watching silently. Eleanor Murphy folded her arms. I warned you children would become a distraction. Grace looked first at Alexander, then at Eleanor. Neither face showed the slightest concern for the embarrassment unfolding around them. Only irritation. Grace gently adjusted Ethan's blanket. I'm leaving. Alexander exhaled sharply. That would probably be best. He pointed toward the lobby. "Security can help you out." The words echoed louder than he intended. Two uniformed security officers instinctively turned toward them. Neither moved. They recognized Grace from previous visits and sensed something deeply uncomfortable unfolding. The surrounding conversations had almost completely stopped now. Executives who moments earlier discussed billion-dollar investments quietly watched a young mother standing alone with two infants while her husband dismissed her in front of hundreds of witnesses. Grace never argued. She never defended herself. She simply looked at Alexander for one long, silent moment, not with anger, not with humiliation, but with a sadness so quiet that Rebecca Turner would remember it long after the evening ended. Grace nodded once. "I hope the rest of your event goes well." Then she turned toward the exit, one infant asleep against her shoulder, the other resting peacefully in the carrier beside her. Across the ballroom, William Murphy had witnessed every second. So had Margaret Ellis. So had Daniel Brooks. None of them intervened. Not because they approved, but because every member of the board had just witnessed something no leadership assessment, financial report, or executive interview could ever fully capture. Character had revealed itself in public. And unlike financial statements or quarterly presentations, moments like these could never be revised after the meeting ended. As the ballroom doors quietly closed behind Grace, Daniel looked toward Margaret. Neither spoke. There was nothing left to add. The record had just become far more complete. Grace did not cry on the drive home. She drove herself. After leaving the gala, she had politely declined the chauffeur William quietly arranged through Daniel Brooks. She knew accepting special treatment at that moment would only complicate the carefully maintained secrecy surrounding her position. Instead, she secured Ethan and Emma into their car seats, started the family SUV, and merged into the late-evening Manhattan traffic. The city glittered around her. Restaurants overflowed with laughter. Office towers still glowed against the night sky. Somewhere behind her, Alexander remained inside Murphy Capital Holdings, celebrating another successful corporate event. Grace's world felt strangely different. Not because he had embarrassed her. That part hurt, but it was not new. What troubled her most was that he no longer recognized the difference between authority and dignity. He believed leadership allowed him to speak without compassion. That misunderstanding was far more dangerous than arrogance alone. Emma stirred softly in the back seat. Grace glanced at the rearview mirror. "It's okay, sweetheart. We're almost home." Her voice remained steady. The twins quickly settled again. Nearly an hour later, she carried both children upstairs after putting them to bed with the familiar routine they loved. Warm bottles, a short bedtime story, gentle music, and the small stuffed elephant Ethan refused to sleep without. Only after both babies were peacefully asleep did Grace finally enter the study. The room was quiet, except for the faint hum of her encrypted workstation. A secure notification waited. Governance Committee meeting confirmed. Attendance required. Tomorrow, 9:00 a.m. Board Executive Chamber. Grace closed her eyes briefly. She already knew why. Not because anyone had told her, because she had watched Alexander destroy months of favorable evaluations in less than 5 minutes. At precisely 9 o'clock the following morning, the Executive Governance Chamber remained completely closed to everyone except board members. No assistants. No executive vice presidents. No department heads. Only the individuals legally responsible for protecting Murphy Capital Holdings. William Murphy entered first. Margaret Ellis followed, carrying several thick binders. Daniel Brooks connected his encrypted laptop to the presentation system before taking his seat. One by one, the independent directors arrived. No one discussed last night's gala until every participant had signed the confidentiality register. William looked around the table. "Let's begin." Daniel activated the first presentation. Executive Leadership Evaluation. Candidate Alexander Murphy. Phase 2 review. No dramatic music, no emotional speeches, just documents. Margaret stood. The purpose of today's meeting is not disciplinary. It is evaluative. She paused. We are determining whether Executive Vice President Alexander Murphy continues to satisfy the leadership standards expected of future senior corporate officers. One director adjusted his glasses. Proceed. Daniel displayed the first slide. Performance metrics, revenue growth, market expansion, innovation benchmarks. Every number remained impressive. Alexander's accomplishments were genuine. No one disputed that. Another director nodded. Excellent operational performance. Margaret agreed. Yes. She clicked the remote. The next section appeared. Leadership Conduct Assessment, Employee Feedback, Cross-Functional Evaluations, Ethics Observations, Corporate Culture Indicators. The tone inside the room changed immediately. Several anonymous comments appeared. Executive frequently dismisses differing opinions. Constructive criticism is increasingly discouraged. Junior managers hesitate to raise concerns. Public interactions occasionally create unnecessary embarrassment. William remained expressionless. Every director silently continued reading. Then Daniel opened another folder. Additional documentation. A security video from the previous evening appeared on the screen. No audio at first, only images. Grace standing quietly with Ethan sleeping against her shoulder. Emma resting peacefully in her stroller. Alexander walking toward them. Several executives nearby. William watched without interruption. Margaret spoke calmly. The recording comes from Ballroom Camera 4. Installed by Venue Security. Continuous recording. No edits. Daniel enabled the audio. Alexander's voice echoed through the conference room. I told you this wasn't the place for that. Grace answered quietly. I'm taking him outside. You should have stayed home. Silence filled the board chamber. The recording continued. I wanted people to meet the twins, not hear them. Another director slowly folded his hands together. Nobody interrupted. Then the final sentence played. Security can help you out. The recording ended. Daniel turned off the monitor. No one spoke for nearly 30 seconds. Finally, one independent director quietly asked, Was Mrs. Murphy disruptive? Daniel answered, No. Review of all available footage confirms the infant cried briefly for approximately 11 seconds. The mother immediately stood to leave before Executive Murphy approached. Another director looked toward Margaret. Any company policy violated? Margaret answered carefully. No. The issue is not policy. It is judgment. William finally broke the silence. Leadership is exercised most clearly when dealing with people who cannot advance your career. No one disagreed. Margaret opened another folder. There is additional information. Employee statements collected after the gala. Not complaints. Observations. Several executives had voluntarily contacted Human Resources that morning. One statement read, I became uncomfortable witnessing a senior executive publicly humiliate his wife while she cared for 2 infants. Another. The interaction raised concerns regarding emotional maturity expected from executive leadership. Another. The incident distracted investors more than the crying child ever did. No exaggeration, no personal attacks, simply professional observations. William looked toward the independent directors. You've reviewed months of leadership assessments. You've reviewed financial performance. You've reviewed culture evaluations. What changed yesterday? One elderly director answered quietly. Yesterday, the private pattern became public. The room remained silent. Grace attended remotely through encrypted video from her study. Her screen remained dark, according to board protocol. She listened. Nothing more. She did not request to speak. She did not defend Alexander. She did not criticize him. Her responsibility required neutrality. William knew she was connected. So did Margaret. Neither acknowledged it. The meeting continued. Margaret transitioned to another agenda item. Internal audit. Rebecca Turner joined through secure conference line. She summarized preliminary financial findings. No conclusions have been reached. Documentation collection continues. Several expense categories require clarification. One director asked, "Any indication of intentional misconduct?" Rebecca answered immediately. "Too early. We have irregularities, not conclusions." William nodded approvingly. "Good. We investigate facts, not assumptions." The board unanimously agreed. The internal audit would continue without interference. Alexander would not be informed until document preservation finished. Standard governance procedure. Nothing unusual. Back at Aurora Dynamics, Alexander enjoyed one of the best mornings of his career. Several investors congratulated him on the gala presentation. Brian Foster walked into his office smiling broadly. "Everyone's talking about you." Alexander laughed. "I hope for the right reasons. They loved your presentation." Nathan entered carrying coffee. "And rumor says the board meeting today concerns executive restructuring." Brian raised an eyebrow. "Maybe they're finally ready." Alexander leaned back confidently. "I've worked hard." Nathan grinned. "You've earned it." Alexander believed every word. He had no idea that the board meeting taking place at that exact moment had almost nothing to do with promotion. Meanwhile, Grace finished disconnecting from the secure conference. She remained sitting quietly for several minutes. The nursery monitor showed Ethan and Emma happily playing with colorful blocks. Grace walked into their room. Emma reached up immediately. Grace lifted her into her arms. Ethan crawled toward her, laughing. Within seconds, both children had completely erased the heaviness lingering from the board meeting. Grace kissed each tiny forehead. "You two don't care about titles." Emma giggled. "You don't care about boardrooms." Ethan grabbed one of her fingers. "You only care whether Mommy comes when you need her." She smiled. "And you're right." For a little while, she allowed herself to forget governance reports, leadership evaluations, and confidential investigations. She simply sat on the nursery floor building wooden towers with her children. Far across the city, Daniel Brooks sent one final encrypted message to every board member before closing the morning session. Subject, Phase 3, authorized. Grace received the notification almost immediately. She already knew what it meant. The board had finished observing. Now they would begin verifying. Alexander still believed his greatest opportunity lay directly ahead. In reality, every document, every decision, every signature, and every public action he had taken during the past year was about to be examined, with a level of scrutiny he had never imagined. And for the first time since his career began, confidence alone would no longer be enough. Monday mornings inside Aurora Dynamics usually followed a predictable rhythm. Department heads submitted weekly forecasts. Finance reviewed cash flow projections. Operations updated project timelines. Alexander held his executive briefing at precisely 8:30. Everything moved with the efficiency he had spent years building. This Monday felt no different, at least not from his perspective. He entered the executive conference room carrying a leather portfolio and a cup of black coffee. Brian Foster and Nathan Cole were already waiting, discussing an upcoming technology conference in San Francisco. "Morning," Alexander said confidently. "Morning, boss," Brian replied with a grin. Nathan slid a folder across the table. The Horizon Analytics acquisition package. Alexander opened it briefly before closing it again. "I'll sign it after the meeting." Rebecca Turner quietly entered a moment later. Unlike everyone else, she carried no coffee, only a thick binder. She took her seat without unnecessary conversation. Alexander noticed. "Everything all right?" Rebecca smiled politely. "Just a busy week." The meeting began. Department heads presented forecasts. Marketing exceeded expectations. Research remained on schedule. Operations reported minor delays caused by supply chain issues. Everything sounded encouraging. Then Rebecca connected her laptop to the screen. Finance update. A series of charts appeared. Cash reserves remained healthy. Revenue continued growing. Profit margins held steady. Alexander relaxed. Exactly what he expected. Rebecca changed slides. "This section concerns discretionary executive expenditures." Alexander looked up. "Go ahead." Rebecca maintained her calm tone. "We've identified several transactions requiring supporting documentation before quarterly certification." Brian frowned. "What kind of transactions? Travel? Client entertainment? Consulting authorizations?" Nathan shrugged. "Normal business expenses." Rebecca nodded. "Most are." She clicked another slide. "Some currently lack sufficient documentation." Alexander answered immediately. "I'm sure accounting can locate whatever's missing." "Perhaps." Rebecca met his eyes. "Until then, I cannot certify those entries." The room became noticeably quieter. Alexander smiled confidently. "No problem. We'll clean up the paperwork." Rebecca simply nodded. "I'll send the list this afternoon." No argument followed, no confrontation. The meeting ended normally. Most executives assumed it was little more than routine accounting. Only Rebecca understood that corporate legal had already instructed her to preserve every original document before requesting explanations. Standard procedure. Nothing personal. After lunch, Alexander received the spreadsheet. 32 expense items highlighted. Several vendor approvals marked for clarification. 3 consulting agreements requiring additional invoices. He skimmed the list. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. Most expenses were legitimate. At least he believed they were. He forwarded the document to his executive assistant. "Please gather everything finance requested." Minutes later, she knocked gently on his office door. "I've already started." "Good. Some files may take a day or two." "No rush." Alexander leaned back comfortably. "They're just being thorough." He truly believed that. Across town, Rebecca sat inside a secure conference room with Margaret Ellis. Stacks of documents covered the table: expense reports, corporate credit card statements, travel authorizations, vendor contracts. Margaret spoke first. "Have any records been altered?" Rebecca answered immediately. "No." "That's encouraging. What concerns me isn't alteration. It's inconsistency." Margaret reviewed another file. "Explain." Rebecca pointed toward several highlighted entries. These dinners were approved as client meetings. No clients appear in visitor records. She turned another page. These consulting invoices reference strategic advisory work. No written deliverables have been submitted. Another page. These travel expenses overlap with personal events. Margaret remained thoughtful. Enough for disciplinary action? No. Enough to continue investigating? Absolutely. Margaret nodded. Continue. We're establishing facts. Nothing more. Late that afternoon, Grace logged into the board portal while Ethan and Emma played nearby with oversized foam blocks. Emma proudly stacked 3 blocks together before they collapsed. She clapped anyway. Grace laughed softly. Still counts. Her tablet displayed several new uploads. Internal Audit Progress Report. She opened the summary. No accusations, no recommendations. Only collected evidence. Expense records preserved. Electronic approvals archived. Corporate email backups secured. Vendor interviews scheduled. Grace appreciated the discipline. The investigation remained professional, objective, exactly as it should. She never once considered intervening. Alexander deserved the same fairness every employee deserved. No less, no more. Her phone rang. The caller ID displayed William Murphy. Grace answered. Hi, Dad. How are my grandchildren? Ethan just discovered he can throw blocks across the room. William laughed. A valuable leadership skill. Grace smiled. Emma applauds every disaster he creates. They're learning teamwork. His voice softened. And how are you? Grace understood the real question. I'm fine. You don't sound convinced. She looked toward the children. I wish things were different. So do I. William remained quiet for several moments. Then he spoke carefully. You know I can't interfere. I know. The board must reach its own conclusions. I understand. Another pause. I'm proud of you. Grace closed her eyes briefly. Thank you. You've remained exactly who you were raised to be. Fair, patient, and stronger than you realize. Grace changed the subject before emotion overtook her. How are you holding up? William smiled sadly. Watching your daughter suffer is harder than any hostile takeover I ever negotiated. Grace knew he meant every word. Yet neither of them mentioned Alexander again. There was nothing left to say. The evidence would eventually speak. Meanwhile, Alexander prepared for an executive networking dinner at one of Manhattan's most exclusive private clubs. Brian Foster arrived first. Nathan Cole joined minutes later. Over expensive steaks and imported wine, the conversation quickly turned toward promotions. Brian raised his glass. I've got a feeling. Alexander smiled. About what? The board. Nathan nodded enthusiastically. Everything points toward restructuring. Brian leaned forward. If William Murphy steps back next year. Alexander finished the sentence. Someone has to move up. Nathan laughed. Exactly. Brian looked around before lowering his voice. I've heard rumors. Alexander smiled with genuine curiosity. What rumors? That the board has already chosen the next generation of leadership. Alexander's eyes brightened. Really? Brian shrugged. Nobody knows who. But, he lifted his glass, if I had to bet. He pointed playfully toward Alexander. It would be you. Alexander laughed. You've had too much wine. Maybe. But tell me I'm wrong. Alexander didn't answer. He didn't need to. His silence revealed how deeply he had begun believing the same thing. At that exact moment, several miles away inside Murphy Capital Holdings, Daniel Brooks completed another confidential administrative task. He uploaded the final succession documents into the secure governance archive. Official appointment resolution. Chairperson. Grace Murphy. Activation date. pending board confirmation. Daniel reviewed every page twice before applying his encrypted digital certification. Then, he locked the file. Only 5 people in the corporation possessed authority to access it. Alexander was not one of them. The following morning, Rebecca received another batch of accounting records from Aurora Dynamics. Most questions were answered. Several were not. One expense report immediately drew her attention. Luxury waterfront restaurant. Approved by Alexander. Purpose listed as executive client retention. She checked reservation records obtained through corporate reimbursement verification. The table had been reserved for 4 people. Only 2 names appeared: Alexander Murphy, Brian Foster. No clients. Rebecca frowned. Perhaps clients had arrived separately. She checked visitor reimbursement forms. Nothing. Parking reimbursements. Nothing. Corporate calendar. Nothing. Again. Not proof of misconduct. But another inconsistency. She documented it carefully before placing the file into the growing audit binder. By Wednesday afternoon, Margaret Ellis reviewed the latest findings. The pattern had become clearer. Not criminal, not sensational, simply careless. Documentation repeatedly failed to support executive spending decisions. Combined with Alexander's increasingly poor leadership evaluations, the picture growing before the board became difficult to ignore. Late that evening, Grace tucked Ethan and Emma into their cribs after reading their favorite bedtime story. Both babies quickly drifted asleep. She quietly returned to her study. A new notification awaited. Phase 3, audit update complete. She opened the report. Near the end, one sentence stood alone beneath the financial summary. Additional executive authorizations appear to exceed delegated approval limits. Legal review recommended. Grace stared at the sentence. Alexander had signed thousands of documents during his career. If even a handful exceeded his authority, the consequences could extend far beyond reimbursement paperwork. She slowly closed the tablet. For the first time since the investigation began, she realized this might no longer be about poor judgment alone. It might soon become a question of corporate accountability, and somewhere across the city, Alexander Murphy slept peacefully, completely unaware that one signature he barely remembered placing on a routine approval form was about to change everything he believed about his future. Alexander Murphy woke before dawn feeling unusually optimistic. For the first time in weeks, nearly every major project under his supervision appeared to be moving exactly as planned. The Chicago acquisition had entered its final review phase. Investors continued expressing confidence in Aurora Dynamics. Industry analysts praised the company's long-term strategy. Most importantly, an email from Daniel Brooks had arrived late the previous evening. Executive governance session attendance required Thursday, 10:00 a.m., Board Executive Chamber. Alexander smiled when he read it. This had to be it. He had spent months imagining the moment when the board would finally recognize everything he had accomplished. Promotion, expanded authority, perhaps even appointment as Chief Executive Officer of Murphy Capital Holdings someday. He carefully selected his navy Italian suit, polished his shoes himself, and chose the silver cufflinks Grace had given him on their 3rd wedding anniversary. Ironically, they remained one of his favorite possessions. Grace noticed the cufflinks while preparing breakfast. "You haven't worn those in a while." Alexander adjusted them proudly. "They bring good luck." Grace smiled faintly. "I hope today goes well." He kissed Ethan lightly on the forehead before the little boy reached toward his tie. Emma laughed from her high chair, waving a spoon in the air. Alexander smiled genuinely. For a brief moment, he looked exactly like the man Grace had once fallen in love with. Then his phone vibrated. Brian Foster. Alexander answered immediately. Morning. Brian sounded almost excited. You ready? I've never been more ready. Nathan Cole joined the conference call. I heard 3 independent directors flew in yesterday. Alexander laughed. Then today's definitely important. Brian lowered his voice. My guess? Leadership announcement. Nathan chuckled. I've already started thinking about office renovations. Alexander smiled. Let's survive the meeting first. He ended the call feeling more confident than ever. Grace quietly watched him gather his briefcase. You'll be home for dinner. I doubt it. If today goes the way I think, he smiled broadly, we may have something worth celebrating. Grace nodded. I'll make your favorite. He left without noticing the sadness hidden behind her gentle smile. She wasn't sad because he might succeed. She had once wanted nothing more than to see him thrive. She was sad because she already knew today's meeting had been called for entirely different reasons. After taking the twins to a nearby park for their morning walk, Grace returned home just before 9. Margaret Ellis had already sent the encrypted conference link. Today's meeting would begin with the board. Later, certain executives, including Alexander, would be invited inside. 2 completely different sessions, one invisible to him. Grace settled Ethan and Emma on a soft playmat inside the nursery before opening her secure workstation. Daniel Brooks appeared first. Good morning, Chair. Grace smiled politely. Good morning, Daniel. Only during confidential meetings did anyone address her by title. William Murphy entered moments later. So far, Margaret Ellis answered. All documents verified. Rebecca Turner joined remotely. The audit package is complete. William nodded. Excellent. He looked toward Grace through the encrypted connection. Are you prepared? Grace answered honestly. I wish this meeting weren't necessary. So do I. William's expression softened. But necessity doesn't ask permission. The independent directors gradually arrived. Once everyone had connected, Daniel formally opened the governance session. The agenda appeared on every screen. Executive Leadership Review. Audit Findings. Succession Resolution. Grace quietly read each item. Nothing had changed. Nothing had been added. The process would follow exactly the legal framework established years earlier. One director spoke first. Has the audit reached a conclusion? Rebecca answered. We have concluded document collection. Margaret continued. Legal analysis is complete. William folded his hands. Then we proceed. Daniel displayed the first summary. Executive authority exceeded on multiple vendor approvals. Corporate policy violations involving delegated financial limits. Repeated documentation deficiencies. No evidence of personal theft. No evidence of accounting fraud. However, significant failures of executive governance. Grace appreciated the distinction. The board refused to exaggerate. Facts remained sufficient. Another director looked toward Margaret. Your recommendation: administrative accountability. Removal from executive authority pending further review. William remained silent. Every independent director already understood the implications. Alexander had built an impressive career. Unfortunately, leadership required more than impressive results. At exactly 10 o'clock, Daniel paused the confidential session. The executive has arrived. William nodded. Invite him. The secure connection to Grace remained active. She would observe remotely, but would not appear on the public conference screen. Moments later, Alexander entered the executive board chamber. He had never been inside this particular room before. Dark walnut walls, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan. The Murphy Capital Holdings crest displayed behind William Murphy. Every independent director already seated. Margaret Ellis, Daniel Brooks, Rebecca Turner. Alexander smiled confidently. "Good morning." William returned the greeting. "Please have a seat." Alexander thanked him before sitting near the center of the long conference table. He noticed several unfamiliar binders, probably promotion materials, he assumed. William began calmly. "Alexander, first, thank you. Your division has achieved excellent financial performance." Alexander smiled. "I appreciate that. The entire team has worked hard." William nodded. "We agree." Another brief silence followed. Alexander expected congratulations. Instead, Margaret Ellis opened the first binder. "We'll begin with governance." Alexander blinked. "Of course." Daniel activated the presentation screen. Alexander recognized several expense reports. His own signature appeared repeatedly. Confusion replaced confidence. Margaret spoke carefully. "This is not a disciplinary hearing. It is an executive governance review." Alexander straightened in his chair. "I understand." Rebecca calmly summarized the audit. Supporting documentation, approval authority, expense verification, delegated financial limits. Everything presented professionally, nothing emotional. Alexander listened attentively. Several items surprised him. "I can explain those." Margaret nodded. "You'll have that opportunity." The meeting continued. More documents appeared. Vendor approvals, policy references, delegation matrices. Alexander answered each question as accurately as he could. Some explanations proved reasonable. Others sounded less certain. The independent directors took notes without interruption. Then Daniel displayed another slide. Leadership Conduct Assessment. Alexander frowned slightly. Employee interviews, anonymous observations, communication concerns, public leadership behavior. He looked genuinely surprised. "I wasn't aware anyone felt this way." William finally spoke. "Leadership isn't measured only by what a leader intends. It's measured by what others consistently experience." Alexander lowered his eyes. Daniel reached for another file. The board also reviewed a recent incident. Alexander immediately knew. The gala. His confidence wavered for the first time. Margaret played the security recording. Every word echoed through the room. "I told you this wasn't the place for that. You should have stayed home. Security can help you out." Alexander stared silently at the table. Hearing his own voice from an outside perspective felt completely different. It sounded colder, sharper, smaller. The recording ended. William asked quietly, "Would you like to comment?" Alexander hesitated. He swallowed. "I was under pressure." Margaret nodded. "We understand. But pressure explains behavior. It does not excuse leadership." Another director leaned forward. "Did your wife create a disruption?" Alexander answered honestly. "No." "Were the children behaving unusually?" "No." "Then why approach her publicly?" Alexander searched for an answer. None sounded adequate anymore. Across the city, Grace watched the meeting in complete silence. She had expected anger, perhaps defensiveness. Instead, for the first time in months, she saw uncertainty on Alexander's face. Not because of her, because he had finally been forced to view himself through the eyes of others. The board paused for a short recess. Alexander remained alone inside the conference room. He loosened his tie slightly. The room suddenly felt much larger than before. Daniel quietly entered carrying a sealed folder. Without saying a word, He placed it before William Murphy. Across the front appeared one sentence: Confidential Chairperson, Succession Resolution. William rested his hand on the unopened folder. Then he looked toward the conference room doors. "The next portion of today's meeting," he said calmly, "will address the future leadership of Murphy Capital Holdings." Alexander slowly straightened in his chair. Despite everything that had just happened, a small part of him still believed the announcement might somehow change his fortune. He had no idea that the folder resting only a few feet away contained the one name he would never expect to hear: Grace Murphy. The conference room remained completely silent, not the uneasy silence that followed difficult questions. This was the kind of silence that existed only when people understood they were about to witness something that could not be undone. William Murphy rested one hand on the sealed folder in front of him. He did not open it immediately. For more than 30 years, he had signed acquisition agreements worth billions of dollars, defended the company during economic recessions, and negotiated with governments across multiple continents. Yet this document weighed more heavily than any of them. It represented not only the future of Murphy Capital Holdings, it represented whether years of careful planning had truly prepared the next generation. Alexander sat upright across the table. Although the earlier discussion had shaken his confidence, he still assumed the succession announcement had little to do with him. Perhaps the board intended to introduce a new governance structure. Perhaps William would delay retirement. Perhaps another senior executive would receive additional responsibilities. Whatever happened, Alexander believed he remained part of the company's future. William finally spoke. "Before we continue, I want every person in this room to remember something." His voice remained calm. "Leadership is not a reward. It is not compensation for past success. It is a responsibility entrusted only to those who consistently place the institution above themselves." No one interrupted. Daniel Brooks quietly unlocked the secure document. Margaret Ellis confirmed the legal certification numbers. Each independent director received the final resolution electronically. Every signature had already been verified. Every procedural requirement had been satisfied. Nothing about this moment was spontaneous. It had been years in the making. William nodded toward Daniel. "Please read the resolution." Daniel stood. His voice was clear and deliberate. "Pursuant to the bylaws of Murphy Capital Holdings Article 7 regarding executive succession." Alexander listened politely. The legal language continued for several minutes. Corporate governance, board authority, voting certification, independent review, succession eligibility. Everything sounded remarkably formal. Then Daniel reached the final page. Following unanimous approval by the independent members of the board of directors, Alexander instinctively straightened, effective immediately. He held his breath. "The position of chairperson of Murphy Capital Holdings is hereby permanently transferred to..." Daniel paused only long enough to verify the final line. "Grace Murphy." Silence. No one moved. Alexander blinked once, then again. He looked toward William as though expecting him to correct a misunderstanding. Instead, William simply nodded. "The resolution has passed unanimously." Alexander let out a quiet laugh, not because anything seemed funny, because his mind refused to process what he had just heard. "I'm sorry." He looked around the room. "I think there must be some mistake." Nobody answered immediately. Margaret Ellis calmly slid another folder across the conference table. "There is no mistake." Alexander opened it. Inside were certified corporate records, board resolutions, governance documents, confidential succession agreements, legal certifications dating back several years. Every page carried official seals. Every signature had been notarized. Near the top of one document appeared Grace's full legal name: Grace Elizabeth Murphy, Chairperson Designate, effective upon board confirmation. Date of execution, 18 months earlier. Alexander stared at the page. 18 months. His voice barely emerged. Margaret answered quietly. The succession process began years before that. Alexander looked toward William. You knew. William met his eyes steadily. Yes. And Grace? William nodded once. Grace completed every requirement established by the board. Alexander slowly shook his head. No. He struggled to form the sentence. She's been home, taking care of the twins. Daniel spoke for the first time since reading the resolution. She has. Alexander frowned. Then how? Margaret answered. Remotely. Secure governance systems. Confidential committee participation. Executive reviews. Strategic approvals. The board has continued receiving her work throughout her maternity leave. Alexander stared speechless. Images flashed through his mind. Grace sitting quietly beside the nursery while he answered emails. Grace reading books to Ethan and Emma late at night. Grace smiling gently whenever he returned from work, convinced he alone understood corporate strategy. How many evenings had she been reviewing the same documents he believed only senior leadership could access? How many mornings had she quietly completed board responsibilities before preparing breakfast for their children, the realizations struck with painful force? He had mistaken silence for ignorance. William continued. The board required absolute confidentiality, not because Grace lacked ability. Because every future chairperson must be evaluated without public influence. Another independent director added, she received no special treatment. Alexander looked toward him. What do you mean? We challenged every recommendation she made. We rejected proposals when appropriate. We required independent analysis. She earned this position. No one in the room sounded defensive. They simply stated facts. Margaret opened another file. You should also know that Chairperson Murphy voluntarily requested not to participate in voting regarding matters directly involving you. Alexander looked up sharply. What? To avoid any conflict of interest. Independent directors handled those decisions. Alexander lowered his eyes. Even now, even after everything. Grace had refused to use her authority against him. Daniel activated the large presentation screen. A timeline appeared. Year 1, Grace joined governance training. Year 2, committee leadership assignments. Year 3, strategic acquisition reviews. Year 4, independent leadership evaluations. Year 5, confidential succession approval. Maternity leave, remote governance participation, official appointment. Alexander stared at the screen. Every major corporate milestone he admired, Grace had quietly helped shape, without recognition, without publicity, without ever mentioning it at home. William spoke gently. Do you remember asking Grace whether she missed contributing? Alexander nodded slowly. I do. William continued. She never stopped. The words settled over the room like heavy rain. Alexander suddenly remembered dozens of conversations. Times he had explained business concepts she already understood. Moments he assumed she could never appreciate executive pressure. The evening he proudly described an acquisition she had likely reviewed before he ever saw it. The lunch where he joked that changing diapers created less value than running a company. The gala, the ballroom. Security can help you out. His own voice echoed again inside his memory. Except now the scene looked completely different. Not because Grace had secretly been powerful, because she had known the truth, and still chosen dignity instead of humiliation. Alexander quietly covered his face with one hand. No words followed. Margaret did not rush him. Neither did William. Several moments passed before William spoke again. There is one final matter. Daniel opened another document. Chairperson Murphy has submitted written instructions regarding today's proceedings. Alexander looked up. Instructions? Daniel nodded. They were filed before this meeting began. He unfolded the document. Chairperson Murphy requests that all decisions involving Executive Vice President Alexander Murphy be based exclusively upon documentary evidence, financial records, corporate policy, and applicable law. He continued reading. She further requests that no consideration be given to their personal relationship. Alexander closed his eyes. Grace had protected him from favoritism, even now, especially now. Daniel finished the final paragraph. The chairperson declines any opportunity to address Executive Murphy personally during these proceedings. Another silence filled the room. One independent director quietly observed, "That may be the strongest demonstration of professional integrity I've witnessed in many years." No one disagreed. William finally stood. "I believe it is time." He pressed a button beside his chair. Outside the conference room, the executive assistant opened the doors. Employees waiting in the adjacent executive lounge stood respectfully. Senior vice presidents, division presidents, corporate officers, all had gathered for the official public announcement. Daniel looked toward William. "The media team is ready." William nodded. "Then let's welcome our new chairperson." Across town, Grace finished buttoning Emma's tiny blue sweater while Ethan laughed beside her, trying unsuccessfully to put his own shoes on the wrong feet. Her secure phone vibrated. A single message from Daniel Brooks. "The board has completed the resolution. Your presence is respectfully requested." Grace looked at her sleeping children only moments before they had awakened, then toward the waiting garment bag hanging quietly inside her closet. Inside it rested the navy suit she had not worn since beginning maternity leave. The time for secrecy had finally come to an end. Grace stood quietly in front of the garment bag for several long seconds before unzipping it. Inside hung a navy-tailored suit she had worn only a handful of times during the confidential years of her succession training. Nothing about it was extravagant. No designer logo, no unnecessary ornament. Just clean lines, precise tailoring, and the understated professionalism expected of someone entrusted with leading one of the country's largest privately held corporations. She laid the jacket carefully across the bed. Emma crawled toward it first. Tiny hands reached for one of the silver buttons. Grace smiled. "Not this one, sweetheart." Ethan laughed as his sister stubbornly refused to let go. For a brief moment, the room felt wonderfully ordinary. Then Daniel Brooks called. "We're ready whenever you are." Grace looked at the twins. "I'll need 20 minutes. We've arranged childcare." "I know. Thank you." After ending the call, she picked up both children and carried them downstairs. Waiting in the living room was Evelyn Carter, the nanny who had helped occasionally during medical appointments since the twins were born. Evelyn smiled warmly. "You look nervous." Grace laughed quietly. "I've negotiated acquisitions worth hundreds of millions. This somehow feels harder." Evelyn glanced toward the suit upstairs. "Because today isn't about business." Grace nodded. "It's about truth." She knelt before Ethan. "Be good for Miss Evelyn." The little boy hugged her neck without understanding why his mother suddenly looked so emotional. Emma copied him a moment later. Grace kissed both children. "I'll be home tonight. I promise." Only then did she walk upstairs and change into the navy suit. Looking into the mirror afterward felt strangely unfamiliar. For more than a year, she had seen herself almost exclusively as a mother raising twins. Now, both versions of her life quietly merged into one. She picked up a simple leather portfolio. No expensive jewelry. Only her wedding ring remained on her hand. For now. 40 minutes later, a black company sedan stopped beneath the private executive entrance at Murphy Capital Holdings. Unlike previous visits, security officers immediately stood at attention. Neither saluted dramatically nor bowed. They simply acknowledged the office she now officially held. "Good afternoon, Chairperson." Grace smiled politely. "Good afternoon." Inside the executive corridor, Daniel Brooks waited. "You look exactly like yourself." Grace smiled. "I'll take that as a compliment." "It is." Daniel handed her a slim folder. "Only the public announcement remains." Grace opened it briefly. The schedule was straightforward. Official introduction, acceptance remarks, board acknowledgement, media photographs, executive transition, nothing more. She appreciated that. This day did not belong to spectacle. It belonged to governance. Daniel led her toward the executive board chamber. As they approached, Grace noticed several familiar executives waiting nearby. Some recognized her immediately. Most assumed she had simply arrived to support William Murphy. A few smiled politely. Others barely noticed her. Then the conference room doors opened. William stepped forward first. Every conversation stopped. "Ladies and gentlemen," his voice carried effortlessly through the executive floor, "thank you for your patience." Behind him stood the independent directors, Margaret Ellis, Rebecca Turner, Daniel Brooks. Finally, Grace. Alexander remained several steps behind William. His eyes never left his wife. He still looked as though reality had become something unstable beneath his feet. William continued. "For many years, Murphy Capital Holdings has prepared for an orderly transition of leadership. The process has now concluded." He stepped aside. "I am honored to introduce the new chairperson of Murphy Capital Holdings." He smiled toward his daughter, Grace Murphy. For 2 full seconds, no one reacted. Executives stared. Department presidents looked at one another. Several investors frowned in confusion. Then Daniel Brooks began applauding. Margaret Ellis joined. Rebecca Turner followed immediately. One by one, the independent directors stood. The applause slowly spread across the executive floor, not because everyone fully understood, because they trusted the board's judgment. Grace walked forward with measured confidence, not quickly, not dramatically. She reached the podium and looked across the room. She recognized almost every face. People she had quietly observed for years. People who had never known she observed them at all. She adjusted the microphone. "Good afternoon." Her voice remained calm. "I know today's announcement comes as a surprise to many of you." A few quiet laughs eased the tension. "For reasons of corporate governance, confidentiality has been essential throughout the succession process." She paused. "That confidentiality has now ended." She did not mention Alexander. She did not mention the gala. She did not mention humiliation. Instead, she continued. "This company was never built by one individual. It has always depended upon thousands of people whose names rarely appear in headlines. Engineers, accountants, receptionists, technicians, legal professionals, parents who return home after long days hoping they still have enough energy to read bedtime stories. Several employees smiled. Grace continued. Leadership carries authority. But authority without humility eventually loses the trust that makes leadership possible. Alexander lowered his eyes. No one else seemed to notice. Grace never looked directly toward him, not once. Her remarks focused entirely on the future. I will ask every executive, including myself, to meet the same standards. Transparency, accountability, respect. Those principles are not optional. They are the foundation upon which Murphy Capital Holdings will continue moving forward. The room erupted into genuine applause. Not loud, not theatrical, steady, respectful. William watched quietly from the side. Pride filled his face. Not because Grace had become chairperson, because she had become exactly the leader he always believed she could be. After the formal remarks concluded, reporters entered for a brief press availability. Questions immediately followed. When did the succession process begin? Grace answered. Several years ago. Why was it confidential? To ensure objective evaluation. Were you actively involved while on maternity leave? Yes. Remotely. Whenever my responsibilities as a mother allowed. Another reporter asked, "What message do you hope employees take from today?" Grace smiled gently. That titles should never replace character. Across the room, Alexander listened silently. Every answer deepened his understanding of how little he had truly known about his own wife. The reporters eventually departed. Only senior leadership remained. Margaret Ellis approached the podium carrying another folder. The next matter concerns the executive governance review. The atmosphere changed immediately. Grace stepped away from the podium. As previously instructed, she said calmly, I will not participate in decisions involving Executive Vice President Alexander Murphy. She looked toward the independent directors. The matter remains entirely within your authority. William nodded. Thank you. Grace quietly took a seat along the side of the room, far from the head of the table. She intentionally placed herself outside the decision-making process. Alexander watched in disbelief. Even now, she refused to use her new authority against him. Margaret opened the audit binder. Rebecca Turner activated the financial presentation. Daniel distributed certified copies of supporting documentation. One by one, the evidence appeared. Corporate credit card statements, vendor approval records, travel authorizations, expense reports, electronic approval logs. Then came the email archive. Rebecca explained each item carefully. No single document establishes misconduct. The concern arises from repeated patterns. Margaret added, executive authority was exceeded on multiple occasions. She projected the delegation policy onto the screen. Highlighted beside it were Alexander's digital approvals. Several exceeded the authorization limits assigned to his position. Alexander leaned forward. I honestly believed those approvals had already been delegated. Margaret nodded. We considered that explanation. She displayed another email. The delegation matrix had been sent to Alexander 6 months earlier. His own reply acknowledged receiving it. The room fell quiet again. Alexander slowly sat back. He remembered the email now. He had skimmed it, intending to review it later. He never had. Rebecca displayed another file. Restaurant reimbursements, luxury entertainment expenses, missing supporting documentation. Again, no fraud, but repeated failures to comply with executive governance standards. Each individual mistake appeared manageable. Together, they painted a picture of an executive whose confidence had gradually replaced careful judgment. Grace listened without expression. Not because she felt nothing, because this was no longer a conversation between husband and wife. It was the corporation fulfilling its obligation. And every document now appearing on the screen proved something Alexander had never fully understood. Power did not collapse because of one dramatic mistake. It eroded quietly, one overlooked responsibility at a time. Fan 13. The elevators were unusually quiet that afternoon. Most executives had already returned to their offices, carrying on with quarterly reports, client meetings, and project deadlines. Murphy Capital Holdings continued operating exactly as it always had. Markets did not pause because one executive lost authority. Neither did time. Alexander stood alone inside the elevator, staring at his own reflection in the polished steel doors. His navy suit was still perfectly pressed. His tie remained neatly centered. From the outside, he looked exactly like the successful executive who had entered the building that morning. Inside, almost everything had changed. For the first time in years, no assistant was waiting outside his office with a schedule. No department heads were asking for approvals. No congratulatory messages filled his phone. Instead, Daniel Brooks had quietly informed him that his executive access had been temporarily modified. His office would remain available while the transition occurred. However, approval authority had been removed. Corporate policy. Nothing personal. Alexander understood. The company he had helped grow was now protecting itself exactly as it had promised every shareholder it would. He stepped into his office one last time before the interim leadership team assumed responsibility. The room suddenly felt unfamiliar. Awards lined one wall. Photographs from industry conferences filled another. A framed magazine cover displayed the headline, "The Executive Driving the Future of American Innovation." Only days earlier, he had admired it. Now it looked strangely incomplete. The article had praised vision, confidence, and ambition. It had never mentioned humility. He opened the top drawer of his desk. Inside lay dozens of business cards collected over the years. Investors, government officials, technology founders, consultants, people who had wanted something from him. He wondered how many would still call tomorrow. A gentle knock interrupted his thoughts. Brian Foster stepped inside. He looked uncomfortable. "I heard the decision." Alexander nodded. So did everyone else. Brian closed the office door. "I'm sorry." Alexander managed a faint smile. "You don't have to apologize." Brian hesitated. "I should have said something." Alexander looked up. "What do you mean?" Brian sighed. "There were times when you joked about Grace." I laughed. "I shouldn't have." Alexander remained silent. Brian continued. "I kept telling myself they were harmless. They weren't." Alexander slowly sat down. "No, they weren't." Nathan Cole appeared moments later. Unlike Brian, he looked shaken. "They reassigned me." Alexander frowned. "To where?" "Corporate communications. Temporary." Nathan laughed bitterly. "I suppose I'm fortunate." Alexander remembered that Nathan had approved several executive entertainment reimbursements without verifying documentation. The board had apparently decided additional oversight was necessary. Again, not revenge, accountability. Nathan looked toward the magazine cover. "I thought we'd both be celebrating promotions today," Alexander answered quietly. "So did I." Neither man spoke again for several moments. Finally, Brian asked, "What are you going to do?" Alexander looked out the window toward the Manhattan skyline. "I honestly don't know." The answer surprised him. For years, he had always possessed a plan, a target, another promotion. Another achievement. Today the future appeared uncertain. After his colleagues left, Alexander packed only a few personal belongings. Family photographs, a fountain pen Grace had given him before his first executive promotion. A drawing Ethan had somehow turned into colorful crayon lines across heavy paper. Emma's tiny handprint preserved inside a small wooden frame. He stared at that frame for a long time. How many evenings had Grace created those memories while he remained at the office chasing another quarterly goal? He slipped it carefully into his briefcase. Across the executive floor, Grace officially moved into the chairperson's office. She had seen the room many times during confidential meetings. Today was different. It now belonged to her. The office reflected William Murphy's personality. Elegant, without excess. Large windows overlooking Central Park. Bookshelves filled with biographies, legal texts, and corporate histories. No oversized desk dominating the room. Instead, a large round meeting table occupied the center. William had always believed leadership required conversation before commands. Grace smiled when she noticed he had left one framed photograph behind. It showed Ethan and Emma asleep together during their first visit to the office months earlier. Daniel entered carrying several folders. The transition documents. Grace nodded. Thank you. He placed them neatly across the table. There's one more matter. Grace looked up. Alexander requested a private conversation. She remained silent. Daniel quickly added, only if you're comfortable. Grace walked toward the window. For nearly a minute, she watched traffic moving far below. Finally, she answered, I'll meet him. But not here. Daniel understood immediately. The family conference room? Grace nodded. Neutral ground. An hour later, Alexander stood waiting inside a modest conference room on the 22nd floor. No executive artwork, no impressive city views, just a simple table and 6 chairs. When Grace entered, neither of them spoke immediately. She wore the same navy suit from the announcement. He still wore the silver cufflinks she had once given him. Alexander stood. You look... He stopped himself. Congratulations. Grace smiled politely. Thank you. They sat across from one another. Not husband and wife, not chairperson and executive. Simply two people whose lives had reached a painful intersection. Alexander spoke first. I didn't know. Grace answered honestly. I know. No. He shook his head. I didn't know who you really were. Grace looked at him quietly. You knew who I was. He frowned. I thought I did. You knew I loved our children. Yes. You knew I'd support your career. Yes. You knew I'd always celebrate your successes. Alexander lowered his eyes. Yes. Grace folded her hands together. Those things were always true. The title changed nothing. Silence settled between them again. Alexander finally asked the question that had haunted him since the board meeting. Why didn't you tell me? Grace answered without hesitation. Because I legally couldn't. He nodded slowly. And if you could have? She looked toward the table. I wanted to. Alexander closed his eyes briefly. I would have believed you. Grace remained quiet. After several moments, she asked gently, would you? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, memories flooded back. Every time she had offered an opinion about business, he had dismissed it. Every time she had quietly suggested caution, he assumed she simply worried too much. Every time she remained silent, he interpreted it as lack of knowledge. Finally, he whispered, I honestly don't know. Grace appreciated the honesty. It took me a long time to admit that. Alexander looked at her. I've been trying to understand something. What? You never defended yourself. Grace smiled sadly. There wasn't anything I could say. You could have told me. I couldn't. You could have argued. Would that have changed your mind? Alexander searched for an answer. None came. Grace continued softly. When someone has already decided who you are, they usually stop listening. Alexander felt every word. She wasn't accusing him. She was describing him. He reached into his briefcase and removed the small wooden frame holding Emma's tiny handprint. I found this today. Grace smiled warmly. She cried because the paint felt cold. Alexander laughed quietly despite himself. I wasn't there. No, I wasn't. Another long silence followed. Finally, Alexander spoke. I'm sorry. Not loudly, not dramatically. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't expect anything. He swallowed. I'm sorry. Grace looked at him for several seconds. She believed him. That did not erase what had happened. But she believed him. I accept your apology. Alexander looked up hopefully. She gently continued. Acceptance isn't the same as repairing trust. His shoulders slowly lowered. I know. Grace reached into her portfolio and removed another folder. Margaret Ellis had prepared it earlier. Alexander immediately recognized the heading. Petition for dissolution of marriage. He closed his eyes. Grace spoke gently. My attorney will handle everything. There won't be arguments. No public accusations. No attempt to keep the children from you. Alexander looked at her in disbelief. You're not asking for sole custody. She shook her head. They need their father. They also need stability. We'll build both. Tears threatened for the first time that day. Alexander looked away. Grace quietly stood. I truly hope you complete the governance program. He looked up. You do? Yes. Why? She answered with complete sincerity. Because Ethan and Emma deserve to know a father who becomes the best version of himself. She picked up her portfolio. At the door, she paused. Without turning around, she said one final sentence. I never wanted to win against you, Alexander. I only wanted us to stop losing each other. Then she walked away. Alexander remained alone in the conference room, staring at the divorce papers resting quietly before him. For the first time, he understood that the greatest loss in his life had not been his title. It had happened gradually. Each time he chose pride over the woman who had quietly stood beside him all along. Fan 14. 6 months passed with remarkably little public attention. For a corporation the size of Murphy Capital Holdings, leadership transitions were carefully managed. Press releases announced organizational updates. Investors received governance reports. Regulators reviewed the required filings. The media never learned the deeply personal story behind those changes. Grace wanted it that way. So did the board. Corporate leadership belonged in boardrooms. Family pain did not. The first Monday of every month, Grace now chaired the Executive Governance Committee. The routine had become familiar. Daniel Brooks distributed meeting materials 48 hours in advance. Margaret Ellis summarized pending legal matters. Rebecca Turner presented financial compliance updates. Division presidents reported operational performance. Unlike many executive meetings, Grace rarely spoke first. She listened. She asked questions. She encouraged disagreement. One morning, during a discussion about expanding Murphy Capital Holdings' healthcare technology division, 2 senior vice presidents openly disagreed over a proposed acquisition. The room became noticeably tense. Several executives instinctively looked toward Grace, expecting her to end the debate with a decision. Instead, she folded her hands. "I'd like both of you to continue." The executives exchanged uncertain glances. Grace smiled. If intelligent people agree immediately, one of them probably hasn't examined the problem carefully enough. Soft laughter spread around the table. The discussion continued. By the end of the meeting, a third option emerged, and one no one had initially considered. Afterward, Rebecca quietly remarked while gathering her papers, "You've changed the atmosphere in these meetings." Grace looked up. "I hope for the better." Rebecca smiled. "People aren't afraid to think anymore." Grace appreciated the compliment, not because it praised her, because it described the culture she hoped to build. Meanwhile, Alexander's life looked very different. The governance rehabilitation program demanded far more humility than he expected. 3 mornings each week, he attended executive ethics seminars led by retired corporate leaders. He completed governance certification modules covering fiduciary duty, financial oversight, delegated authority, and organizational culture. Twice each month, he met with an independent executive coach selected by the board. During their 4th session, the coach asked an unexpected question. "When did you begin believing your title determined your value?" Alexander frowned. "I never believed that." The coach remained patient. "Think carefully." Alexander considered the question. Finally, memories surfaced. Every promotion had brought more praise, more invitations, more admiration. Gradually, he stopped separating respect from position. Without realizing it, he began expecting one to guarantee the other. The coach quietly nodded. Titles attract attention. Character earns trust. They're not the same thing. Those words stayed with Alexander long after each session ended. The divorce proceedings progressed quietly, just as Grace had promised. No public accusations, no media attention, no attempts to embarrass one another. Margaret Ellis represented Grace only regarding corporate matters. Family law remained entirely separate. Grace hired an independent attorney specializing in collaborative divorce. Alexander did the same. At their first settlement conference, the mediator reviewed parenting priorities before discussing property. Grace spoke first. "Ethan and Emma need consistency." Alexander nodded immediately. "I agree." The mediator looked pleasantly surprised. "We're off to a good start." Grace smiled gently. "The children come first." Over several meetings, they developed a parenting schedule together. Alternating weekends, midweek dinners, shared holidays, joint attendance at school events in the future. Every decision centered on what benefited the twins, not what punished either parent. When financial matters arose, Alexander looked toward Grace. "I don't want anything that isn't fair." Grace answered simply, "Neither do I." Most assets had already been clearly documented. The townhouse belonged to the Murphy family trust. Alexander never argued. His own investments remained his. Joint accounts were divided according to legal guidelines. The process remained respectful from beginning to end. One afternoon, after another mediation session, Alexander found himself waiting outside the building while Grace secured Ethan and Emma into their car seats. Emma waved enthusiastically. "Daddy." Alexander smiled despite everything. "Hi, sweetheart." Ethan reached toward him immediately. Grace looked at Alexander. "Would you like to buckle him in?" Alexander hesitated, then nodded. He carefully fastened the little boy into his seat. Months earlier, he would probably have checked his phone while someone else handled the task. Now he completed it slowly, making certain every strap fit correctly. Grace noticed. She said nothing. Some changes required no commentary. A week later, William Murphy officially announced his complete retirement during a shareholders' meeting. He introduced Grace as the permanent chairperson and thanked employees for supporting the transition. Near the end of his remarks, one shareholder asked, "What gives you confidence in your successor?" William smiled. "I've watched her make difficult decisions for many years." He paused. "But the decision that convinced me most wasn't made in a boardroom." The room grew quiet. She proved she could separate personal pain from professional responsibility. Very few leaders ever learn that. The shareholders applauded. Grace felt unexpectedly emotional. After the meeting, she found her father standing alone in the executive garden overlooking the Hudson River. "You didn't have to say that." William smiled. "I wanted to." "You earned it." Grace linked her arm through his. "I still miss asking your advice every day." William laughed. "You still ask. Now you simply call it a board consultation." They both smiled. For the first time in many months, the weight of transition seemed lighter. Autumn gradually turned into winter. Snow covered Manhattan's rooftops. Christmas lights appeared throughout the city. Grace and Alexander agreed to celebrate Christmas morning together for Ethan and Emma. Not as husband and wife, as parents. The twins, now old enough to run clumsily across the living room, cared nothing about divorce agreements or corporate governance. They cared about wrapping paper, toy trains, stuffed animals, and whether both Mommy and Daddy smiled while they played. Alexander arrived carrying a small wooden rocking horse he had assembled himself. Grace noticed tiny imperfections in the paint. He had clearly built it without professional help. "It's beautiful," she said. "I had to sand it 3 times." He laughed awkwardly. "I've apparently become terrible with tools." Grace smiled. "I think they'll love it." They did. Ethan climbed onto it immediately. Emma insisted on helping push. The horse barely moved. Both children laughed anyway. Watching them, Grace realized something important. Healing did not always restore what had been broken. Sometimes, healing simply created something different, something quieter, something honest. Later that afternoon, while Ethan and Emma napped upstairs, Alexander prepared to leave. He stopped near the front door. "I wanted to thank you." Grace looked at him. "For what?" "You kept your word." She waited. "You never tried to turn the children against me." Grace answered softly. "I said I wouldn't." He nodded. "I didn't deserve that kindness." Grace looked toward the staircase where faint laughter from the baby monitor echoed softly. "It wasn't for you. It was for them." Alexander smiled sadly. "I know." He stepped outside into the falling snow. Grace watched through the front window as he walked toward his car. Not alone. Never completely alone. Because 2 small children already loved him without measuring his titles, salary, or past mistakes. They only wanted their father. And perhaps that was the greatest opportunity Alexander Murphy had ever been given. Not another promotion. Not another executive office. A second chance to become the kind of man his children would one day be proud to remember. 3 years later, Murphy Capital Holdings had become a different company. The financial headlines focused on measurable success. Revenue reached record levels. Employee retention climbed to its highest point in more than a decade. Internal surveys showed unprecedented trust in executive leadership. Independent governance organizations cited Murphy Capital Holdings as one of the country's strongest examples of ethical corporate oversight. Analysts credited Grace Murphy's calm leadership style. Employees described something less measurable: People felt heard. The company had not become easier. Expectations remained demanding. Performance standards remained high. Deadlines remained unforgiving. But executives no longer confused authority with superiority. Meetings encouraged disagreement. Compliance became part of daily decision-making instead of an obstacle to overcome. Young managers no longer feared asking difficult questions. Grace considered that the company's greatest achievement, not growth, culture. Every Friday afternoon, unless travel made it impossible, Grace left the office before 5. Daniel Brooks had long ago stopped scheduling meetings during that time. Everyone knew why. Friday belonged to Ethan and Emma, no exceptions. One spring evening, she arrived at their elementary school just in time for family reading night. Parents filled the library with folding chairs, picture books, and quiet conversations. Ethan spotted her first. "Mom!" He ran across the room, carrying a stack of books almost too large for his small arms. Emma followed close behind. "You made it." Grace knelt and hugged both children. "I promised I would." Promises mattered, especially the small ones. As they settled together in the reading corner, another familiar voice quietly greeted them. "Am I late?" Alexander stood near the entrance holding 2 children's novels. His suit looked simpler now. No designer watch, no expensive cufflinks, just a father arriving after work. Grace smiled politely. "Right on time." The twins immediately pulled him toward the reading circle. Neither child cared that their parents no longer lived together. They only knew both had shown up. Alexander had completed the governance rehabilitation program nearly 2 years earlier. The board eventually restored his eligibility for executive employment. He declined returning to Aurora Dynamics. Instead, he accepted a senior operations role at a nonprofit healthcare technology organization serving rural hospitals across the Midwest. The position paid less, far less. It also allowed him to build something without chasing prestige. For the first time in many years, he measured success differently. Not by titles, by impact. One evening after the school event, Ethan asked a question neither parent expected. "Mom," Grace looked up from fastening his seatbelt. "Yes." "Were you always the boss?" Alexander instinctively looked toward Grace. She smiled gently. "I wasn't always the boss." "What were you before?" Grace considered the question carefully. "I was someone learning how to become responsible enough to lead." Emma tilted her head. "So, you had homework." Grace laughed. "A lot of homework." Ethan thought for a moment before turning toward Alexander. "What about you, Dad?" Alexander smiled. "I had homework too." "You still do?" Both children laughed. The answer satisfied them completely. Children rarely needed complicated explanations. Years passed. Life settled into routines no one could have imagined during those painful months. Grace continued leading Murphy Capital Holdings. Alexander continued rebuilding his career quietly. William Murphy spent his retirement teaching entrepreneurship at a small university and embarrassing Ethan and Emma with endless stories every holiday. Margaret Ellis eventually retired after mentoring a new generation of corporate attorneys. Rebecca Turner became Chief Financial Officer of Murphy Capital Holdings. Daniel Brooks remained exactly where everyone expected him to remain, calmly ensuring every board meeting began precisely on time. One autumn afternoon, Murphy Capital Holdings celebrated its 50th anniversary. Employees from every division gathered inside the renovated headquarters atrium. Instead of highlighting quarterly profits, Grace insisted the celebration focus on the people who had built the company: receptionists, maintenance staff, engineers, drivers, administrative assistants. nurses from the healthcare division, factory supervisors, everyone. As the ceremony concluded, one young management trainee nervously approached Grace. "Chairperson Murphy," Grace smiled. "Yes, I wanted to ask." The young woman hesitated. "How do you stay calm when people underestimate you?" Grace remained quiet for a moment. The question carried memories she rarely revisited. Finally, she answered, "Being underestimated feels uncomfortable." She smiled softly. "But it also gives you a choice." "What kind of choice?" "You can spend your energy proving people wrong." Grace paused. "Or you can spend it becoming the person you were meant to be." The young employee nodded thoughtfully. "Which is harder?" Grace laughed gently. "The second. But it's also the one that lasts." The conversation ended there. No dramatic speech, no applause, just a lesson quietly passed from one generation to the next. Later that evening, after the celebration ended, Grace remained alone inside the chairperson's office. The city lights shimmered beyond the windows, exactly as they had on the day she officially assumed leadership. Some things had changed. Others never would. She opened the bottom drawer of her desk. Inside rested the small leather notebook she had once kept beside Ethan and Emma's nursery. The notebook containing dates, observations, facts, nothing more. She slowly turned through its pages. The restaurant lunch, the careless jokes, the gala. The words that had once hurt more deeply than she admitted. Security can help you out. She closed the notebook gently. Then she placed it into the office shredder. The machine quietly reduced every page into thin strips of paper. Not because the past had never happened, because she no longer needed to carry it. Forgiveness did not require forgetting. Sometimes it simply meant refusing to relive old wounds forever. Her phone vibrated. A photograph appeared. Alexander had sent it. Ethan and Emma stood proudly beside a homemade science project that had just won first place at school. The caption contained only one sentence. "They wanted to make sure you saw this first." Grace smiled. She replied with a single message. "Tell them I'm incredibly proud. I'll celebrate with them tonight." A few seconds later, another reply arrived. "They already know." Grace slipped the phone into her pocket. She turned off the office lights and walked toward the elevator. No entourage followed. No cameras waited. Only the quiet sound of her footsteps echoed through the nearly empty executive floor. Years earlier, she had walked these same hallways carrying the weight of a secret no one else understood. Now she carried something much lighter. Peace. The world would probably remember Grace Murphy as the brilliant chairperson who transformed Murphy Capital Holdings into one of the nation's most respected companies. Those who worked closest to her remembered something different. They remembered a leader who listened before speaking, a mother who never allowed success to replace compassion, a woman who could have used power to humiliate the person who had once humiliated her, but instead trusted truth, evidence, and justice to do exactly what they were meant to do. Because real strength rarely announced itself. It appeared quietly. It endured patiently. And when the moment finally arrived, it never needed to raise its voice. If there was one lesson hidden beneath every decision, every sacrifice, every silent tear, and every difficult choice in Grace Murphy's journey, it was this: a person's greatest title is never the one printed on an office door. It is the character they carry long after every title has changed. The story ends here, but its question remains with us. How often do we measure people by what the world can easily see? A job title, a paycheck, a position, a public reputation. Those things may open doors, but they cannot reveal integrity, kindness, or quiet courage. Grace never won because she possessed hidden authority. She prevailed because she refused to let authority become a weapon. She allowed the truth to emerge through patience, evidence, and due process, and when the moment finally came, she chose dignity over revenge. Perhaps that's why her journey feels so familiar. Many of us have known what it is like to be underestimated, overlooked, or judged before anyone truly knew our story. Yet, every day offers the same choice Grace faced: to react with anger or to continue building a life that speaks more loudly than any argument ever could. If this story stayed with you, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Where in the world are you watching from, and what part of Grace's journey resonated most with you? Your perspective may encourage someone else reading the comments. And if stories of resilience, justice, and quiet strength are the ones you enjoy returning to, consider liking this video and subscribing so you won't miss the next journey. Thank you for spending your time with us today. Until next time, take care of yourself and never underestimate the quiet power of living with integrity.